Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Orbit Live event. I'm thrilled to be joined by Kim Stanley Robinson and Michael E. Mann, who will be talking to each other about climate change and later on answering your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen and enter your question there. You can also vote on other attendees' questions so that we know which are the most popular and can answer those first. Kim Stanley Robinson is the legendary author of more than 20 works of science fiction, including the best-selling Mars trilogy and the critically acclaimed New York 2140, 2312, and Red Moon. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine, and he works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute. His latest book is The Ministry for the Future, which is out from Orbit this week. Michael E. Mann is a renowned climate scientist and author of numerous books, including Dire Predictions. He is Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State and has received many awards and honors, including NOAA's Outstanding Publication Award in 2002 and selection by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology, also in 2002. His latest book is The New Climate War, which will be published by Public Affairs in January 2021. At the bottom of the screen is a button you can click on to order The Ministry for the Future and pre-order The New Climate War. Once again, use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen to add your questions. We'll be getting to those later in the event. Also, if you'd like to be notified about upcoming Orbit Live events, follow us on Crowdcast by clicking where it says Orbit Live at the top of your screen, and then clicking on the green Follow button. Now it is my great pleasure to turn things over to Stan and Mike. Take it away.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ellen. Well, hi, Mike. Good to see you virtually.
You too, Stan. It's great.
People will quickly come to realize that this is unrehearsed and unstructured conversation between us. So maybe I can lead off by asking you a question about what it's been like to be a point man in the climate wars for more than 20 years. And also, I guess I would frame it like this, that our culture seems to want characters or people, so that even though the scientific community is huge and the climate community is huge and work is often done collaboratively by very large groups, nevertheless, the culture will have a Stephen Hawking, an E.O. Wilson, and really for climate, you have been the go-to guy for such a long time, which means you've taken an enormous amount of crap from people who are for one reason or another, opposed to this project of understanding and dealing with climate change. So, I mean, I myself lose entire nights of sleep over a bad sentence in a good review, and I'm thinking, my Lord, how has it been to be in such a tough fight as one of the leaders?
Well, thanks. I'm not sure my role is quite as central as you describe, but there are a handful of us who have really embraced the role of trying to inform the larger public discourse over climate change. In my case, it really wasn't by design. I was sort of almost an involuntary, reluctant participant in the fractious debate over climate change, and it's because of this graph, the so-called hockey stick curve that we published more than 2 decades ago, that shows how abrupt and how unprecedented the warming that we've seen during the Industrial Revolution actually is in a long-term context. It's a very striking sort of indication of the profound impact that we're having on this planet. And because of that, it became sort of an icon in the climate change debate, and it and I became a lightning rod by, the forces of denial, the forces of inaction. I call them the inactivists, often advocating for fossil fuel interests, who don't want to see us change our way of doing things. They're profiting greatly from our ongoing reliance on fossil fuels, and they've fought tooth and nail to prevent us from making that necessary transition. And anything that conveys, the threat of climate change effectively to the public is a threat to them. And so I think the hockey stick really was a threat to those vested interests. And I found myself suddenly as a postdoctoral researcher who, had never intended to be in the fray. I studied applied math and physics as an undergraduate, went off to graduate school in physics, eventually decided to get into climate science. And I had no idea at the time that would ultimately set me on a path where I would find myself at the center of this debate. And you sort of allude to something interesting, which is that we do, and as a writer, you understand and you demonstrate the powerful nature of narratives and how we think in terms of stories and narratives, and we do think in terms of individuals. The hero, the villain, however you want to describe it, and that it's great if you find yourself, in a position where you're able to influence the conversation in a productive way because of, the prominence that you've achieved. But at the same time, it can also be used by the forces of darkness, as it were. If you can focus all that negative attention on somebody and try to turn them into a villain, then you can try to make them an example for others. And I think the attacks against me in part were intended to make me an example of, what will happen if you too, as a scientist, come out and you talk to the public and policymakers about the threat of climate change. We'll come after you as well. And so it cuts both ways, I suppose, but I've remained sort of firm and dedicated. It's not, like I said, it's not what I signed up for, but I ultimately come to embrace the opportunity that this has given me to participate in this vital conversation, along with folks like you and others who are making a difference. It's exciting to be part of that. And so in the end, if I were going to do it all again, people ask me would I do things differently? I think I'd make the same choices, even though it isn't what I signed up for. Yeah.
Are there research projects that you would have liked to do that this overarching career battle has kept you from?
Well, no doubt. I spend a lot of time now on outreach and communication and doing events like this one, which I very much enjoy doing. But it's not actually what I signed up for. It isn't what got me into science in the first place. And so, do I sometimes wonder what else I might have been able to do scientifically had I not sort of gone on this sidetrack, been directed in this other, directed towards this other life that I now live as sort of as a public figure and a communicator. Sure, there are all sorts of questions. I mean, I'm still driven by a basic curiosity, scientific curiosity. I've had it from the time I was a little boy. I'm just fascinated with trying to understand how things work. And I'm constantly encountering, just in keeping up with the science and in doing the science, all sorts of questions that I would love to be able to answer. But I recognize that to do that, I would need a team. I would need students and postdocs, and it would be a major undertaking. And you've got to choose your battles. You only have so much time and space to work in. So I'm sure you, as a writer, as an author, you must have the same challenge. You've got lots of ideas, and you have to focus on a few if you're going to bring them to fruition, I suppose.
Yes, I feel like I have always been lucky in that as a novelist, I only really need one idea every couple of years, and it will take those couple of years. And then when I'm done, I can move on to another interest and sort of follow my interests from one to the next. But somewhat similarly to you, becoming somewhat of a public intellectual and a spokesperson for the reality of the climate crisis, as you rightly call it, it's a over-determining driver in terms of which ideas and which futures I should write about. I can't just write about any future now, because we are. It's not as if there isn't a huge trajectory of possible futures, but they're all going to involve climate in this century. And Absolutely. So if you do near future science fiction and you intend to be a little realistic or relevant, you end up writing about climate. Right. That's been fine. It's been interesting. And I used to worry. My main love is to write novels. I want to write good novels, and that's an overriding consideration, such that if I determined that writing a good novel would mean, ignoring the world and doing art for art's sake kind of thing, I probably would have done that. But my feeling is that good novels come out of engagement with reality, and so the reality that we've got dictates the subject matter of the novels. And then, I'm married to a scientist. I'm a science fiction writer. My wife's an environmental chemist. I'm always writing about scientists at work because I see it, and I've lived it now for 35 years. And it's a skill set. It's a body of knowledge that I have that I can write about that not everybody can write about.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's all turned out pretty well for me. And I must say, although every novelist, and especially one who writes novels as strange as mine, takes an awful lot of flack. I mean, enormous amounts of criticism, to the point where you have to get thick-skinned.
I don't. Common, absolutely, yeah.
But I don't end up in court,
or in the hot seat in the Senate, or under investigation by an attorney general. I hear you.
Exactly. That's very intense, and it seems to me that they took it to you. I've been thinking about it. I just finished your book, which I greatly enjoyed, The New Climate War.
Well,
and the war is a discursive battle. It's a war of ideas. And what you point out in this new book is the newest turns in the war, now that straight denialism is more or less impossible because it's just in our face already. There are new forms that you have identified and given names to. And it strikes me that a lot of them come out of the Greeks, ancient Greeks, with their rhetoric. They are very good at naming every trick of persuasion possible. So that, what you call deflection, which I think is the proper word in English, the Greeks would identify as maybe apoptosis or antiptosis. There are Greek terms for these strategies.
Plato's,
Aristotle's great on it, and it is actually a gigantic field. A rhetorical glossary is huge and hilarious because every possible trick. But one of them that we all know about, and the term is even in English, is the ad hominem attack.
Right.
You attack the person rather than the ideas. And then you talk also about something I think we should get into that's very important, is splitting, that people who are basically on the same side are being pitted against each other by what I call a narcissism of small differences. In other words, it should be a united front. We should be working together. Instead, we're arguing with each other about methods, about details, about points of emphasis.
Yep.
And when that happens, then our side loses.
Right. Absolutely. And they're natural, they're always natural divisions. I identify in particular in the climate space, and there's a whole conversation we can have about why this has happened, but personal behavior has become a central topic, and what we should do as individuals in terms of our lifestyles, what we should eat, how we should travel, etc. And it's so easy to divide people when it comes to matters of lifestyle, because it's very personal. It really gets at your identity as a person, the choices you make in your life. And so I do see constantly how bad actors, you see this on social media, are playing climate advocates against each other by, for example, getting them to debate over their lifestyle choices and deflecting at the same time. And sometimes these rhetorical tricks are used in combination, right? So you create division by doing this, but you also deflect attention away from systemic change towards the role of individuals. And we can have a whole conversation about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've been saying over and over again that earlier time, like even a decade ago, you could talk about either or, like either mitigation or adaptation, either or. But it's an all hands on deck situation now. And so I'm saying it's both and. So you don't argue about, do you have carbon taxes or do you have cap and trade? You don't argue whether it's personal lifestyle changes or governmental regulation or taxes. It's all hands on deck. You do them all. and then you experiment boldly, as FDR said, to boldly experiment with what we need to do and find out what works best.
Right, we
But
don't learn
meanwhile,
by doing, and
right.
in technology, that's how we advance. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, in terms of, it seems to me that your book makes a great emphasis that the obvious thing to do is to put a price on carbon, as the president of the World Bank himself said, and that can take different forms. People often talk about taxes, and taxes are very often attacked from the right, especially. I
Right.
like to, since it is a discursive battle, I would like to call this paying the true cost.
Right.
So the market misprices many, many things
Yep.
by disregarding the future. That's what my book is about.
Yep.
And so if you take into to account the true costs of burning carbon, it would be so much higher that if you published it as a tax in advance and used the lessons of Thomas Piketty and others, that taxing is a powerful force that's already legal, and legislatures do it. So you don't need revolution. You don't need an entirely new economic system, which I personally would love to see. But we've got what we've got right now. We have to manipulate the system we have right now.
Right.
And so in that context,
You might even say it is what it is, in the words of our current president, who I hate to quote, but you exactly as you say, we have to work within the system to ultimately to hopefully change that system, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So do you think, in terms of a political economy, it seems to me that the cost of burning carbon is pretty well calculated, and if we actually laid it out there as a tax of paying the true cost imposed on the market price,
yeah,
the change would be so quick. One thing that your book pointed out that I think is very much worth talking about is we might be at a tipping point towards really good climate action. And that I think is also important. Maybe you can describe why you think that.
Yeah, no, thanks. There's a lot of interesting food for thought in that. First of all, in terms of carbon pricing, I see it as one of the tools in the toolbox, and we can't unilaterally take it off the table. And the forces of inaction would love for us to do that, and they're actually working hard to convince us that that's something we shouldn't do. And they're ingenious about doing that. For example, getting us to think that a price on carbon is necessarily regressive. That frontline communities in the been implemented in Australia and Canada just the opposite way. It's in a progressive way. So it is really important, right? If you're going to price carbon, we have to ensure it's done in a just way so that we have a just transition. And I think a lot of the critics in the progressive side are fearful that it won't be just and that frontline communities will be hit hardest. That doesn't need to be the case, and it can be done and has been done in a way that is in fact progressive. But you also pointed out, one of the problems is that to really fully price the damage that's being done by carbon pollution, that would be a huge carbon tax. And politically, it may be very difficult to get a tax, especially given the current makeup of our Congress. But that could change. In a month, we could have a very different situation where there's a Democratic Congress and Democratic president willing to work together to advance meaningful climate policy. Part of why I'm optimistic that we can see a sea change in less than a month if we all come out and vote on climate. That's the other part of the conversation. But it's a carbon price. It might be difficult politically to get a carbon price that's high enough that it forces us to cut carbon fast enough to avoid catastrophic warming alone. So let's think of it as a tool in the toolbox. We put a price on carbon, but we also have to think of supply side measures, stopping the funding and allowance of additional fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines, coal mining, et cetera. So we have a whole bunch of options that we can draw upon. Subsidies for renewable energy is another way to level the playing field. in addition to pricing carbon, all of these tools. And if you look at the different plans that are out there right now, the Democratic Senate plan, the Democratic House plan, and Joe Biden's campaign, they're all great plans, but they're different. And we're going to have to figure out how to take the best from all of them if, in fact, we have that opportunity. And that's part of why I'm optimistic. I think that we will see a sea change. We will suddenly have an environment that is conducive for climate action, maybe in a little over a month, or at least when we start the new Congress and presidency in January. And the youth climate movement, which is something else we can talk about. The way that the conversation has now been completely recentered by young folks coming out and demanding change, and how that has in many ways been synergistic with the climate justice and the racial justice movement here in the U.S. And all of these things are coming together potentially in a sort of perfect storm of the good kind.
Yeah, that would be a beautiful thing, a utopian thought. And to add to that, I understand what you're saying about a carbon tax that truly paid would be big, but the solution there would be to introduce it in a way that increased over time. Sure. This is a common plan that you started, and then the schedule is there for businesses to adjust to and see that the sooner they change, the less they pay. The other side of this, though, that I'm interested to ask your opinion about, and I know we got Delton Chen listening, that he and others have talked about a carbon quantitative easing, that essentially we've seen quantitative easing massively in 2008 through 2012, and then also with the pandemic. Enormous amounts, like many trillions of dollars, have been made up by the central banks and injected into the system without destabilizing people's trust in money. Right. So what Chen and others, including now Lawrence Sumner's, are suggesting is that the quantitative easing be targeted so that the initial disbursement of money is for sequestering carbon, for clean energy in general. So there's a carrot as well as a stick. Right. And social scientists have showed that when there's a carrot as well as a stick, even though economists regard both of them as incentives and perfectly equal, this makes me laugh because they're not perfectly
psychologically equal. Different, yeah.
Yes, very much so. A kick in the butt versus a kiss, they're not the same. And so the carrot, that you could get paid for doing the right thing in this world, that too would be justice. And speaking as a progressive, I would say that what I see on the part of the progressive movement that somehow becomes angry at science itself because maybe it's been co-opted or whatnot, or it's part of a power system that is so powerful that people are saying, look, if we don't have justice, I don't even care what happens to the climate or anything. Well, the two can be combined in a way that is very important. And if you could make a living rather than a profit by doing the right thing by carbon, regenerative agriculture, and so on and so forth, this carbon quantitative easing strikes me as a crucial brick in the wall.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess, when I say subsidies, I'm being very general in what that means. And I think that you could envision this as sort of accomplishing the same thing. We're actually providing incentives, market incentives for doing the right thing, and jobs in renewable energy and making that a growth industry. And I leave those details, the fiscal details, to the policymakers and the economists. I see my role as trying to inform that conversation when it comes to what are the risks that are involved, what are the targets that we need to meet, and I'm happy to leave it to sort of the politicians to figure out how to make that happen, as long as it's based on that valid ground rules, right? That we accept the risks, and that we accept that we do need to meet these targets, and how we do it. That there's room for worthy political debate about that, and that's what I wish we were debating, and maybe that's where we'll be within a year. If that's what we're doing.
We can hope. You mentioned jobs, and I think it's before we shift over to answering questions that have come in, which I'm very happy to do. I want to tack on one last thought that comes out of this same complex of ideas about really a new political economy that shifts us into a better relationship with the biosphere. There's more work to be done than there are people to do it. The loss of jobs is a kind of a false problem, I feel, focusing in on automation, and so much cannot be automated. And a full employment schedule so that everybody was guaranteed a job, and the jobs could be provided, and they wouldn't be make work, they would be climate work.
Right.
That this is another important part of the justice question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we can hope to see packages of these things come together, and if luck is with us, the Green New Deal is a proposal. It will get tweaked. It will get hammered. It references the real New Deal of FDR's. That was 15 years with 5 giant stages and backfilling, rectifications, corrections, new experiments. The most important part of all, FDR threw in at the last minute with the GI Bill. This was all the New Deal. And so we have to think of the Green New Deal as not just that first House Resolution 103, but actually the ongoing process of the next decade or so.
Yeah.
And, if we get that, that'd be fantastic.
No, absolutely. And and in the end, what the critics are very good about, as you know, is tarring these sorts of terms and weaponizing them and firing up their base, the conservative base, that this is just an effort to take away your freedom and impose socialism and so necessarily. They've been targeting the Green New Deal, the term the Green New Deal, and you see Joe Biden, for example, walking away from that. He did that in the first debate. He literally distanced himself from the Green New Deal, while at the same time having put forward a climate plan that overlaps quite a bit with what's in the Green New Deal. So we're gonna have to recognize that the terminology is going to be weaponized and debated, and keep our eyes on the ball. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And just as you say, there's a broader agenda. Ultimately, over the next decade, we've got a lot to do. And climate action has to be central to all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that seems, I know Ellen is listening and ready to rejoin us as invisible spirit moderator and give us some questions too.
Hello.
Thank you.
We've got a lot of great questions. Just a quick reminder to everyone watching that you can vote on the questions others have submitted. If you want to get the most interesting ones up to the top, go ahead and vote on those. Our first question comes from an anonymous user who says, a couple of years back, IPCC scientists were reported as saying we had 12 years to save the planet. It's now 10 years. Would you say that unless we have radically different policies in place by 2030, we've committed the planet to catastrophic change?
Yeah, so I don't know, Stan, if you want me to take that first. And
please, yes, go first. So,
great question. So, it has been at times overstated, misstated, weaponized by, the critics, like, oh yeah, they say the world's going to end in 10 years, as if to almost caricature what the IPCC had to say. And what the IPCC said in that report on stabilizing warming targets at 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius was that if we want to stabilize warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, a little less than 3 Fahrenheit relative to pre-industrial, we don't have a lot of time left. If you just do the math, it's pretty unforgiving based on the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere and the warming that's caused. And will cause if we continue to do it. You can do the math. How quickly do we have to cut carbon emissions to avoid crossing that threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius? Now, keep in mind, that's not a cliff that we go off. This is much more like a minefield that we're walking out onto. We're already encountering dangerous climate change. If you look at the western U.S. right now, if you look at the Gulf Coast, dangerous climate change is here. It's a question of how dangerous, how bad we're willing to let it get. And it's reasonable to look at a 1.5 degrees, and we're not that far from it, and say we really don't want to go beyond that point. And what are the policies necessary to ensure that we don't? And what that tells you is, we got to bring carbon emissions down by a factor of 2. That was, as you say, 2 years ago. It was 12 years 2 years ago. Now it's 10 years, and we haven't made enough progress over those last 2 years. So we have to even cut emissions faster. What would have been a 5% cut a year is now more like a 7.5% cut a year. If we want to have a reasonable chance of keeping warming below that level. And, to provide some grounds for comparison, the entire sort of economic slowdown, lockdown policies in response to the pandemic, by the end of 2020, will only have cut carbon emissions by about 5%. So we've got to reduce carbon emissions as much as COVID-19 did this year, every year, and then some, if we're going to meet that target. So yeah, we've got to act. We've got to act dramatically. What Trump has done has been to not so much block the action that the progress we were making. We're going to come close to meeting our Paris targets, even without Trump's support. And that's because of what states and companies and municipalities and everybody else is doing. But Paris isn't enough, right, to get us there. We got to go beyond Paris. It's 4 years later, and we need a president who will recognize that even just meeting Paris obligations is no longer a viable strategy. We've got to go well beyond them. I'm confident that President Joe Biden and a Democratic Congress would work together to reassert leadership on the part of the United States so that our world partners come together and we tackle this. And I do share Stan's sort of optimism that there are utopian futures that are still possible. It's up to us. It's up to the decisions we make now. And Stan, I don't know.
Yeah, I would just second what Mike says, and we can go on to the next question with one addition that it's a fallacy to think in terms of absolutes and just think in terms of we either are completely saved or we're completely doomed. It's a mongrel world. It's a emergency century. It's going to be weird throughout. It can get better or it can get worse. It's the wrong question to ask. Is it too late? It's too late for what? Life will go on. Civilization may get hammered, but life will go on. So the best thing to do is to not get into either or sensibilities, and especially not to give up in despair. It may take the focus of civilization, and including our economic system, to be focused on getting into a good balance with the biosphere, by way of carbon reduction and every other good thing that's on the table right now. That becomes more and more intense the longer we delay. So, but what's cool is, I think, and Mike is younger, but we had the same career arc on climate. Over the last 20 years, this has gone from being a somewhat obscure scientists hand raising at the back of the class type thing, oh, we've got a problem, to the central issue of our time. And so even though that's a little bit slow, it's accelerating in terms of how quickly it's coming into everyone's consciousness. So, okay, let's have another question, Ellen.
All right. That question was from Spencer, who took credit for it in the chat.
Thank you.
And our next question is from Chester, who says, is climate change mitigation being discussed anywhere in national security contexts? There certainly seems to be some greenwashing and some movement away from fossil fuels for security reasons, but little else.
Stan, did you want to tackle that first? Do you want me to?
Go ahead. I can briefly say what I have to say there. It seems to me that the Pentagon has been making reports for years that climate change is a national security threat of the first order. And then I will briefly add that the U.S. Navy has been running a safe nuclear program since 1947 with millions of miles and thousands of hours of safe nuclear. And I often feel like the U.S. Navy and the Department of Energy, that we ought to nationalize what little nuclear there is left and put that in service of decarbonization for the generation that's still there. And in other words, the U.S. military is there to defend the United States interests, and the fate of the biosphere is intensely interesting to them.
Yeah, no question about it. If you talk to experts in national security, and during the Trump era, they've been quiet, but behind the scenes, they have been continuing to keep climate change in focus as a national security threat that we have to address. They see climate change as the greatest national security threat that we face because it takes we've got a population of nearly 8 billion and growing people now competing for less food, less water, and less space because of climate change, and that's a recipe for conflict and for a dystopian future if we're not careful. And then the national security community recognizes that. They recognize that climate change is the main threat multiplier that is out there. And so it may be over the last 4 years under Trump, they've had to sort of ride below the radar, I think you will see with a potential Democratic administration, you will see climate change now reemerge as a central focus of our national security community. And so, it's there's another element to it is, do we want to be continuing to fight expensive foreign wars over access to fossil fuels in the Middle East and elsewhere? Because that's what the history has been. Our reliance on fossil fuels and our thirst for fossil fuels from dangerous foreign lands has created much of the conflict that we have seen in recent decades. So, all of these things come together in a synergistic way, when it comes to national security. If you care about national security, getting off fossil fuels and addressing climate change is the most important thing that we can be doing. And I think that message is starting to get through to even some conservative audiences who might not care about all the other dimensions of climate change, but they do care about national security. To the extent that we can get through to them, we can bring on board this other sort of potential constituency when it comes to forming a coalition for climate action here in the US and elsewhere.
Our next question comes from Marjorie, who asks, or who says, "Hi, I work as a political speechwriter. What message would you like to see our elected officials..." Whoops, sorry, the questions are moving around and I just lost that one. But you can probably guess what it was going to be about. What would you like to see our elected officials talking about to their constituents?
Stan, you're the writer.
Well, but you're inventing a good new rhetoric of discourse in this discursive battle, how to, in doing the scientific thing of identifying and doing a taxonomy, doing some analysis, that we need to avoid splitting efforts to split us from our own natural allies, that we need to realize that climate and justice are the same cause, in the same way that I used to speak about leftism and environmentalism as being allies, even though they often were at odds with each other in another false split. So I guess a political leader ought to be saying, look, the biosphere of the Earth is our extended body. Nothing will go well if we don't get into a sustainable, good relationship with this, and we'll be ripping off our descendants in a gigantic Ponzi scheme. So the thing to do is realize that for your own children and grandchildren and all the rest of them after that, for literally billions of people to come, what we do in this generation and even in this coming decade is crucial stuff for how many species are going to go extinct and how well people live with each other. So it's a perfect project for getting everybody on board. It gives meaning to existence, because meaninglessness would be terrible. But we're not in that situation now. We've got a crisis. Everybody's got to get together and fight it. And I think Mike has been face to face with the worst bad actors on the planet, which is a heroic but a pain in the ass role. The larger picture would be that those people can be bought off or overruled by the rule of law, by democratic action.
Yeah.
And once we get that, we've got a civilizational project that's actually quite exciting.
Yeah.
And this is the message I'd want to put out there.
That's great. I mean, if it comes down to a slogan, my slogan today is urgency and agency. There is great urgency in acting, but there is also agency. It's not too late for us to act. And that's very important, because I think one without the other leads us astray. It leads us down the wrong path.
Here's another question about being hopeful. So that leads into this nicely. Doug asks, who's writing the best hopeful science or speculative fiction on a forward view of climate change, e.g. stuff where we do the right things?
I think that would be my partner here.
Well, the competition is not exactly vibrantly stuffed with hundreds of people trying it, which is too bad in a way. And I don't mean to say that it's just me. I would immediately say Cory Doctorow, Jonathan Lethem, all of the new writers writing solar punk. There is a growing utopian or activist strain of young science fiction writers that are out there, and you need to. I know less about them than many because I've been focused on my own books, and I don't want to know for sure what other science fiction writers are doing, so I don't accidentally get crimped in my own imagination. But I know they're out there, and it's a happening thing.
Let me ask you, Stan, why is it that we seem to have so much more of an appetite for dystopian rather than utopian tales? Is it something innate in us? What's your view of why that seems to be the case?
Well, there's a couple things going on. It ties into the movies, and the explosions of car crashes are much more interesting than city council meetings and getting the plumbing right. I mean, those are just not cinematic, and cinema drives a lot of our sense of what science fiction is. And utopia and dystopia are two sides of the same coin. They are both forms of science fiction, even though they both predate it. But when they're set in the future, they're forms of science fiction. Dystopia expresses our fears. We've got a lot of them, and it can be valid, but after a while, it just becomes an indulgence, and I think we're there. Utopia is hard because a plot in fiction is when things go wrong. So utopia is about society running well. And my point for 30 years and more has been that even in utopia, things will go wrong. The stories don't go away. So this has been a minority view, but I think it becomes more prominent as we realize that it's utopia or nothing, a utopia or a catastrophe. In other words, we have to build a good working civilization, or else we've got a biosphere catastrophe. So in my time, utopia has gotten more relevant in my time. Utopia has simply become something that everybody's thinking, well, but wait a second, we can't keep going on the way we are, so we need a different social form.
Right. Yeah, I was just thinking as I was asking that you have, H.G. Wells, the Time Machine, which is sort of a false utopia. We think it's a utopia, and then we learn that it's something quite different.
Yes, the Eloi and the Morlocks. Now, that was a stupendously good science fiction analysis and metaphor for class. Right. You need everybody on board. There cannot be Morlocks, or they will sink the ship.
Right.
So Wells was very good on that, and he's a great precursor.
We've got a couple questions about personal responsibility that are related, so I'm going to give you both of these questions at the same time. The first one is from Adam, who says, I often see an individual behavior is not the problem. 100 big companies are responsible for 75% of emissions, factoid. This seems plausible, but surely these companies make things that people use. Where is the balance? What steps address both? And then the second one is from Daniel, who asks, the big question for me is, what can we as individuals do?
Okay.
Go Mike.
Oh, okay. So, these are synergistic, right? What individuals, systemic, solutions involve collective action. And what's a collective but a group of individuals? The act of voting is an individual act. But by voting, we participate in a collective effort to put in place policymakers who will make the tough decisions and will do the things that we can't do, right? Because we can't, as individuals, impose subsidies on renewable energy or put a price on carbon or, block the construction of new pipelines. Only our policymakers can do that. So that's an important part of the solution. But as I forgot the name of the individual who asked the question. Who was that?
One of those was Daniel and one was Adam.
So that was Daniel. Yeah. So, but we can, as consumers, obviously put pressure on producers, and sort of the millennials are sort of famous, I think, for forcing corporations and companies to change their way of doing things in response to changing consumer demand. So we can affect change through our consumer decisions, our decisions as consumers as well. So it all works together, right? It's just that one can't be a substitute for the other. Individual action can't be a substitute for systemic change and policy, and vice versa.
I would add to that it's a case of both and, where we need the collective and the individual. Americans burn maybe 30 times as much carbon as your ordinary citizen of India or Bangladesh. And so, but this is partly our infrastructure, that you can't not burn a lot of carbon in the American infrastructure. So it's best to avoid guilt tripping of oneself or of others, and then giving up, like, oh, I can't live any different way. But you can treat it as a matter of style. You can live a stylish life that burns less carbon and spends less money, and it feels better. You find yourself that you're no longer cocooned by crap, which are cocooned by oil, and you're living a little bit more into the elements and thinking for yourself, and living becomes more artful, and that's important. So it's not wearing a hair shirt or renunciating great, beautiful things that you love that you have to give up on. Most of that was crap. And so you can move into a more engaged and alive relationship to the planet by thinking about burning less carbon. And as Americans, I think that matters. But again, infrastructure and the collective are also crucial. But the main thing is not to be too guilt-tripping of other people or of yourself. I think the Dalai Lama said, we all have to burn some carbon. That's part of being alive. And so then, you pick and choose what carbon you burn and try to keep it down to what you actually need. Yeah.
No, I agree completely. And I think not only do you feel better about yourself, but you're setting a good example for others. And there's a multiplier effect. And that's part of the solution, right? We can all be better individuals and better stewards of the environment, and we should strive to do so. But as Stan says, we shouldn't be shaming people over their behavioral choices, because that backfires. That ends up causing them to be resentful of the efforts to change our way of doing things. So let's try to invite those people on board and set good examples for them to follow, rather than shame them over their individual behaviors.
This next question is from Aviva, and it references one of Stan's works, but it is a question for both of you. In 50 Degrees Below Zero, Stan memorably mentioned that we are terraforming the Earth, but we don't know how. Stan or Mike, how is that terraforming coming now?
Stan.
Sure. This will be a good thing that I want to ask Mike about too. So terraforming is a term out of science fiction, Jack Williamson, 1938, and I became closely associated with it with the project of terraforming Mars, which Mike's hero Carl Sagan was very involved with as a theoretical exercise back when we first got the good look at Mars that we got with Mariner and Viking. And it has enough volatiles that if you heated it up, it looked like in this whole universe that Mars might be the best candidate to give a Earth-like climate to, by heating it up and then taking our genetic material, our plants and animals there, and quickly having a second Earth. Well, it turns out that doesn't work except on perhaps, I fondly think, the 10,000 to 50,000 year scale. So there is no planet B, but the term terraforming has been shifted, even in my Mars trilogy, to Earth itself as a kind of a joke. And you can't talk about terraforming Earth without feeling kind of sick to your stomach. So we have this word geoengineering. And the notion being that we deliberately do things on a mass scale to alter Earth's environment to cool it down. It's got a bad reputation pretty much everywhere. And even the scientists researching it are uneasy and tentative and saying, look, we might need to know these things. And I think that geoengineering could also be described more broadly as deliberately trying to come into a right balance with the biosphere, which I don't think we should seed the ocean. I don't know if we will put dust in the atmosphere to cool the temperatures. In an emergency, I think some nation state might decide to do that, as in my novel. But what I'm interested in doing is broadening the definition and bringing it back into the discussion, because we do need to come into a right relationship to the biosphere. So let's say, for instance, that women's rights are a geoengineering technique. Now, what do I mean by that? If all the women on this planet had the rights that the UN Declaration of Human Rights allows them and that all the nations have signed to, the reproduction rate would drop to about 1.5 to 1.8 women per children per woman, and the replacement rate is like 2.1 or 2.2 children per woman. So although population is seldom brought up in these discussions, the fewer humans we got voluntarily and slowly over time, the less stress on the planet. And so you could say, in other words, that justice is a geoengineering technique. And that's how I want to broaden the discussion.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a societal engineering, and why shouldn't that be part of what we think of? That's a good sort of geoengineering tool. And as you alluded to, there are some scary ones, right? These planetary scale interventions with a system that we don't understand perfectly is rife with potential for unintended consequences. And many of the schemes that have been proposed for shooting sulfate particles into the stratosphere to block out the sun, or dump iron into the oceans to try to seed algae that take up carbon from the atmosphere, algae in the ocean. When you look into detail at the potential ramifications of these schemes, you find that there is the potential for some real unintended consequences. And to me, it sort of violates. I like to think of this as sort of comparable to the oath that doctors take to, first do no harm. Well, as planetary doctors, as it were, our oath should be to first do no harm. And in many cases, in my view, the geoengineering schemes that have been proposed violate that principle. But then there are others. As Stan alludes to, we may need a stopgap solution if we just don't reduce carbon emissions fast enough and we're facing ever more catastrophic impacts. There are certain things that we might call geoengineering that are relatively safe. Sucking the carbon back out of the atmosphere, technically speaking, is geoengineering, but you're sort of trying, to solve the problem at its source rather than a cover-up solution. But it's expensive to do. And the argument would be, yeah, it's really expensive to do that, but it's also really expensive. In fact, arguably will be more expensive not to prevent, ever worse climate change. So it should be part of the conversation. We should continue to do research, if for no other reason, to understand some of those potential unintended consequences. Much of the research, in my view, that's been done on geoengineering by scientists in my field actually provides good arguments for not doing it and for doubling down in our efforts to solve this problem at its source, preventing the buildup of carbon pollution in the atmosphere.
Karen asks for your opinions on nuclear power.
Stan.
I would like to read a analysis that I trusted more as to the total carbon savings of nuclear. I would like to keep it on the table as a bridge technology to full renewable. I would like the U.S. Navy to be in charge of all nuclear power in the United States, and it be not for profit but for safety that we run these things. It's when people cut corners trying to make a profit out of it that we get the worst danger of accidents. I think it may be that its time has passed that we already have clean renewable in such vast amounts that we don't need nuclear like we thought we did even a decade ago. And I think it's a state of flux, but I guess the thing I would end up with, and the same with geoengineering, is we're in an all-hands-deck situation. Let's not be knee-jerk response to anything just because of our pre-existing political ideology. And I say this as a leftist, and I know that on the left there's instantaneous knee-jerk reactions against both nuclear and geoengineering, but often that slides also into market incentives and to science. And so, to me, I think everything should be on the table.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and in fact, I often use pretty much that same framing when people ask me about this. Let's keep it on the table. Now, we may decide to take it off the table. Let's have that conversation about what are the relative rewards and risks of each of these options. And as Stan points out, there's a credible argument made by people like Mark Jacobson at Stanford and other researchers in into the sort of state-of-the-art deployment of renewable energy technology. There's an argument that can be made that we can get to where we need to be through existing renewable energy technology and simply incentivizing it and scaling it up massively. And if that's the case, then that's sort of a less risky path than relying on nuclear energy. In addition, nuclear power plants require huge government subsidies. So what I find somewhat amusing, and again, Stan sort of gets at this, there's sort of a political history here when it comes to nuclear energy. And it goes back to the protests in the 1970s that I remember when I was growing up. It's sort of almost hippie punching to say, that you're for nuclear energy. Sometimes it's a way of sort of bashing the hippies who were protesting it. But often that comes from sort of conservatives. And yet, if you look at this from a sort of market perspective, if you're truly a libertarian free marketeer, nuclear would be the last option that you would choose because it requires huge government subsidies. It's not viable in a free market. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. If your argument is that this is a natural market solution to the problem, it's not. A more viable market solution is to incentivize and scale up existing renewable energy technology. And again, it doesn't necessarily come with the same risks, but I come back to the same place as Stan. Let's have that conversation. Let's keep all these things on the table and let's debate, what a true solution looks like. It'll bring some people to the table that otherwise wouldn't have come, in my view.
We're coming up to the end of the hour, but I'm going to try to give you one or two more questions to finish up. The first of those is from Kiman, who asks, does science fiction influence scientists working in environment and climate change?
Well, I guess as the scientist, I can answer in the affirmative. There's no question. And Stan and I had a conversation earlier before this event, and we were both Carl Sagan was a hero to both of us, and just the vision that he had of and his appreciation of environmental problems like climate change stemmed from his natural curiosity about sort of extraplanetary, the deep questions that we might ask about our place in the universe, and is there life out there, and if so, what would it take to detect it, and do civilizations do they go on to flourish, or do they ultimately extinguish themselves? Lots of deep questions that have implications for how we confront problems like climate change. And I think it's telling that one of Carl Sagan's greatest contributions was a work of fiction. It was Contact. And in fact, there's a line from Contact, from the end. It's for little creatures such as us, is actually the title of a book now that his daughter, Sasha Sagan, has written that sort of, in some ways, extends Carl Sagan's legacy and talks about some of the same basic fundamental questions that he pondered. But here you could see that Sagan, one of the great scientists of our time, one of the great, if not, I will just say the best science communicator, the best science communicator of all time. And he recognized the powerfulness of narrative. And as again, one of his greatest contributions was a work of fiction, Contact, that is one of my favorite films. And I love watching it with my daughter because the hero is a young girl who goes on to become the great scientist who, I won't give away the plot if you haven't seen the film or read the book. But it's empowering for women, when it comes to STEM and women in science. There's so many things that I like about it. I'm actually interested, Stan, in your thoughts about Contact. And
it's one of the great science fiction movies, and the book is filled with Sagan's ideas as a planetologist, and he was really important in working collaboratively with Soviet scientists to work on astrobiology and the idea of how we might recognize alien civilizations. And this was very speculative in his time, but has become a burgeoning field. And it always makes me laugh. Astrobiology, clearly science fictional, since we don't know of any life off Earth right now, and yet a viable working science. And I've just recently become aware through my friend Adam Frank, who also is a great science communicator, that you can perhaps read the spectral signals off of other planets, literally hundreds or even thousands of light years away, and perhaps see the signs in their atmosphere that a technology had to have been at work, which is a beautiful new way of investigating this.
Yeah,
I think in general, science fiction and science are very tightly coupled, but it's kind of a commentary orbit that I read the sciences. I get story ideas instantly. I write them down. Young people read science fiction and later they become scientists, and partly because of that inspiration.
Yeah.
So this double action is very asymmetrical when it comes to how quick it happens. But that's good. It allows for influence on both sides, and it's one of the reasons that I call science fiction the realism of our time. It really is the fiction that gets to the reality that we're living now, which is this giant science fiction scenario that we're all creating together.
Right.
So I mean, I'm a fan of the. What can I say? I'm a humanist or an artist that thinks that the sciences are the central intellectual activity of our time, and they have been for maybe 400 years or so, and all to the good, and more would be better. So this is where government is the battlefield. Can we make government work according to the scientific method and therefore be more responsive to what everybody wants to have happen, which is a ongoing civilization and a good relationship to the biosphere that we depend on? And science leads the way in that, but the arts are the way that we talk to each other. So,
amen, my friend. And and maybe a good closing note, because we have an election, in less than a month, where we can choose our path, and there is a good path forward still, and we have an opportunity to choose that path.
Yeah, that's a great place to wrap up.
Yeah, I absolutely second that one, and I hope that we can. If we were to run this again in maybe 3 months, we could do some planning session. Maybe when your book is actually released, we can go to town on actions to do.
Would love to do that. I hope we can continue this conversation. It's been very pleasurable.
Yeah,
thank you, Stan and Mike.
Thanks for your work, Mike.
And thanks to you for your work.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen.
Thank you, too, to everyone who attended. Thank you for your great questions, even though we didn't get to all of them. This conversation was recorded, so if you'd like to share it with friends, they can access the replay at the same link you used to enter the event today. Don't forget to click on the link at the bottom of the screen to order your copies of The Ministry for the Future and The New Climate War. Again, Ministry for the Future is out this week, and The New Climate War is out in January. And again, be sure to follow Orbit Live on Crowdcast to be notified about other events. Stan or Mike, any last notes before we close for the night?
To be continued.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah. Vote.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Have a great night, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, Ellen. Good night, all.
Thanks.